So today's going to be a little bit different as far as my content usually goes. It was requested that I show off a little bit of my creative process in regard to sound design specifically, and I suppose by extension, just my artistry in a more general sense. So, in that vein, I intend to make a lot more content that shows off new things that I make related to sound design. But for this video, I actually want to take a look at a video I did a few months back where I superimposed all my own sound design over the Overwatch main menu. The story of how I made a lot of those sounds is either undocumented or kind of scattered and buried in other videos on my channel. So I thought a good launching point for this would be to delineate what I made for that video and how. Since that content already exists, it's just not all in one place. With that, let's get started. This might be a little bit atypical as far as a creative process goes, being that Overwatch already has a benchmark of what it's supposed to sound like, as opposed to asking myself, what do I want this to sound like? There's more of a target that's already in place for me. Also worth note is that a lot of creative projects don't necessarily actually happen in a linear order. I've tried to order this as best I can for easy viewing and understanding of what happened throughout the creative process. But there wasn't necessarily any linear structure. The structure that I will be presenting this in is imposed on it. With that said, the sounds I ended up making for that video were a primary menu selection standby, which I refer to as the angelic hover, a primary menu select, which is a combination of a cymbal splash and a confirm sound, submenu selection standby, the card noise as I like to call it, submenu select, which is kind of a charge up sound and it's specific to the role selection screen. The ready up select, which is just for confirming the selection before you start matchmaking. Confirm and cancel sounds, which are, as they sound, a selection confirmed or selection canceled yes and no option sounds. Winston's grunts and etc. sounds, his armor clatter, excuse me. And after that, a little bit of discussion on music compositions that I did for that too, since I did all the sound in the video. Those being the loading background music, the main menu triumphant music, the arcade standby hover chiptune music, and the ambient menu music. There actually might be more sounds than that. Again, this didn't happen linearly, so I don't necessarily have it all comprised into one neat package that I can quickly present. But looking over the video, I believe these are all the sounds that I created for it. And I found that I was actually very surprised to recall just how much attention to detail went into identifying and reconstructing menu sounds to my ability. With that, let's get started on number one. So, first we have the primary menu selection standby, the angelic hover, as I like to call it. It was really the first sound that I identified when I was braining up this project. Whenever you hover the mouse over one of the main menu options in Overwatch, you get this magical sound. And it puts the selection into this standby state. And I dubbed that sound, that magic, the angelic hover. Funnily enough, the sound I ended up using as my main sample, my main sound source, was recorded with a different intent. If I recall correctly, I was originally aiming to record mechanical sounds for a video game project that I'm working on my own. I wanted this engine / power noise, and it's supposed to be set in this like abandoned research facility. As you might be able to tell in the audio right now, I have actually a furnace and a refrigerator not very far away from me. And so the brainwave I had was, if I have those sounds, why not turn them from a curse into a blessing? Why not make them useful? So, I ended up recording the sound of the central air/furnace system in my house to make that power noise. And while I was doing it, I ended up realizing that the sound had enough high-end information to potentially be the angelic hover that I had originally identified before I started recording that. In manipulating the sound, I eventually found that it actually worked better as the angelic hover. I didn't end up using it for the power noise that I wanted. What ended up being that noise will probably be in another video as I work on more of these creative process showcases. But for now, back to the Overwatch video. So after some processing with distortion and EQ in Reaper, I ended up landing on this kind of digital noise. It's still like reasonably soft, not piercing. It feels delicate in a way that I was very much looking for in order to achieve that magic sound. If I were to approach this again in the future, I might consider layering some sine waves, as I've been learning a lot more about additive synthesis, subtractive synthesis, etc. My result's definitely effective, I think, but I still must be curious as to how Blizzard actually achieved that sound. Next is the primary menu select. I have written down here Cymbal Splash, though I now realize it's actually a combination of two sounds. But as far as the Cymbal Splash element goes, being the main menu, it's supposed to have more dominant sounds. And when originally editing the video, I noticed there was this gong-like decay. I actually had done something like that before on one of my songs. I wanted this gong-like swell, and so I decided to obviously approach it in a similar way where I just used my drum kit, using mallets that I created myself to get a swell going and a decay going. I had considered using a Tibetan singing bowl, but I found it was a little harsher than I wanted at the time. I think the more obvious approach of the cymbal ended up being the right move, though I wouldn't mind experimenting with the singing bowl again. The Cymbal Splash, as I mentioned before, is actually combined with another sound. It's just the confirmed sound that I made, which I will discuss later. Third on the list, I have the submenu selection standby, which I call the card noise. This was another one that I identified pretty early on. Submenus in Overwatch, and I think the main menus too, but submenus I particularly noticed have this sound that many might overlook as a basic click. But as I was starting to pay attention more to sound design, I noticed that the sounds present in the retail package for that event sounded actually extremely similar to playing cards being dealt from a deck. And part of what clued me in on that idea is that the menu options in a lot of the submenus actually have a shape similar to a playing card. They're this tall, rectangular shape. So I actually assume that's intentional, or at least that was the creative thought process behind Blizzard's sound designers. This definitely ended up being one of the easier and more fun sounds that I created for this video, as it's essentially just Foley recording. At the point of time that I was implementing this, I had also just done coursework for Wise 101 on Audio Kinetics website. And I had recently realized that sound playback in video games often has a randomization element to it, so that it's not repetitive and annoying. And so that's something you should notice in my implementation as well. There were 3 samples I originally chose for the card select standby sound. I ultimately dropped one of them. I wasn't quite happy with the sample that I got. So there, I believe, are only 2 present in the final product. Though, in principle, the variation still was achieved. Next is the submenu select, specifically the role submenu, whenever you're selecting what role you would like to play in the quick play mode. I believe this sound was actually a reuse of the card select sound, though I processed it more in Reaper to sound more technological. And I used the sample as a MIDI sample to give it that increasing intensity. I felt that making it sound like it was charging upward was a really good way to give auditory feedback for that element of the menu selection, as at that point the player is committing to something. They're committing to their gameplay decision. Next up, I have the confirm ready up sound. The ready up sound was one that was definitely done on the fly at the end of the project. As I continued to listen to the sample audio that I was using as reference to identify what the designers at Blizzard had actually done. I, at the time, happened to be working on props for an indie film, and I had a catheter syringe on my desk. And as I was braining up more sound sources, it seemed just an obvious opportunity to try that sound as a sample. And I could get some really nice succinct and percussive sounds out of it by pulling the plunger out, or some really airy sounds out of it by just using the plunger normally. Like that. The sound of the plunger being pulled is the core of that sound, then sampled as MIDI and layered over itself at whatever pitches happened to help accomplish my goal. It also actually contains some of the cymbal sound with some delay processing. That's what that cascade is after you hear the ready up be selected. So next is the confirm and cancel sounds. These are actually the first sounds I worked on with the goal of getting into sound design and for this specific project. The root of these sounds is actually me just fiddling with a piece of paper. I believe it was an envelope. I sampled that, and as a MIDI sample, I ended up composing a short jingle with some processing. Processing, which I have up on another screen right now, looks to be just some EQ and compression. While putting those sounds together, I found that a confirm sound worked best with some upward movement in its tone and pitch, while the cancel sound worked best with downward movement. The confirm sound does have a little bit of downward movement in it. There's 2 static notes, and then it goes up, and then it drops below the static note. I found that going too upward felt unfinished, and potentially too cheerful. It's simply supposed to confirm. It's not supposed to be exuberant. The cancel sound going entirely downward, I felt worked very well, being that it sounds a lot more disappointing. It's saying no. And I feel that that's very important for both sounds to be conveying in that way, as it makes the selections for the player more tangible, and kind of adds a flow to the menu as you back in and out of menus. 7, I have Winston's grunts, armor clatter, etc. As far as Winston's grunts go, those were quite fun for me as it was really a practice in voice acting. To my recollection, there wasn't actually any VO in my reference recording, but I felt it really appropriate for the visual as Winston moved around and he ultimately put his fist down. Why wouldn't he be letting out a groan of some sort? The clatter of his armor as he pushes his glasses up, I am reasonably certain was actually just me putting my glasses on a desk. The desk I happen to be sitting at right now, in fact. While the sound of him putting his fist back on the ground was the sound of me pounding my desk. It was very much a practice in using what I have around me to get the best results I can. Outside of all of that sound design, there were also music compositions. Being that this is supposed to be a little bit more focused on sound design, I'm not going to talk about those compositions as much. But in some short detail, the loading game background music, I believe, was really just an altered pad from Expand in Pro Tools. It happened to work well for what I was looking for. I altered it with some significant EQ, but otherwise, it was just a pad that sounded great for a waiting area. After that, there's the main menu triumphant, or like tense music. That composition was reasonably fun for me, as I don't always approach that type of music, more like orchestral and symphonic pieces. So I enjoyed the challenge that I was giving myself there. To my recollection, the reference video being filmed during the Olympic Games, it actually had a much more different piece that sounded regal and honorable. While the piece that I composed for it was more akin to the standard music. That was definitely what I was going for more. I wasn't trying to replicate the Olympic theme that they had. I wanted the tense combat feel and the anticipation. Next, I have the arcade standby hover chiptune music. This is actually one of my favorite bits that I did in this project, in part because of how it lets me show off my attention to detail and my technical knowledge of sound. So in Overwatch, when a player hovers over the arcade menu option, it goes into a standby mode in which it plays this 8-bit style jingle, sounding like it's from an arcade or a classic console. And with technical knowledge of what makes something sound like it's a chiptune piece, I went into Pro Tools. I could have done Reaper, but I ended up using Pro Tools this time with the Union synthesizer, producing square waves, and I focused on making this very short, cheerful chiptune piece. I think works very successfully with its momentary limelight. A quick note, while I was editing this, I remembered that there was a percussion channel. Looking at it, to get the percussion sound that I did where it's very toy-like, it was simply a MIDI drum kit that I threw distortion on to get the cheap toy sound that you might get from an older style game. And finally, the ambient music that happens after you get out of the main menu. Largely, it's Union, Vacuum in Pro Tools, and a little bit of Expand in Pro Tools with some EQ compression. There is one channel strip that has a little bit of distortion on it. It's really carried melodically by just the Union synthesizer and a little bit of that padding. It was rather simple to put together, and if I had wanted to do it without the pad from Expand, I probably would have just done vocal samples, because that's really what ends up the shape of the sound that ends up coming through the pad. It's almost like male oohing and aahing, not very intense. And so with that, that really should be all of the sounds that I made for that video. There could be a couple left out, though I've looked over most of my sessions. I don't think there's anything missing. If there is, they were probably created in a similar fashion of synthesizers, EQ processing, compression processing, samples from whatever I could find around me to make an interesting noise. And all around, I think it worked out pretty well. My actually primary improvement that I, now looking at this critically in retrospect and with a few months of reflection, I suppose, the video is oddly quiet. I'm not sure why I made it so quiet. I might just be uploading a new version of it with some improvements, or just at least a level boost. But other than that, that is the summary of my sound design process for that video. And I look forward to explaining other sound design approaches in the future. Check in later.